Keep her steady! We're losing altitude too fast.
The white infinity of the Arctic ice stretched in all directions, merging on the horizon with the heavy leaden sky. The wind drove sharp snow dust across the frozen surface, mercilessly scratching the faces of the people lying on the ice. The wreckage of the gondola stood out as black spots against this pristine background, disrupting the perfect geometry of the polar desert. Everything changed in a second, turning a triumphant flight into a merciless struggle for each subsequent breath. Scattered around were pieces of metal and torn fabric, which until recently had been the pride of Italian engineering. Umberto Nobile lay in the snow with a broken leg, trying to comprehend the scale of the disaster. Pain pulsed through his body, but even stronger was the pain of realizing that their majestic airship was gone. There was no way back, and the sky that had once offered salvation now seemed like the most dangerous enemy. The ice beneath their feet was not solid ground, but a frozen ocean, ready to crack open at any moment. Nature was in no hurry to kill them. It was simply waiting for them to give up and close their eyes. They did not yet realize this, continuing to consider themselves proud conquerors of the unexplored northern latitudes. But at that very moment, they ceased to be explorers and became mere survivors. The base on Spitsbergen greeted the Italian team with harsh winds and low gray clouds hiding the tops of the cliffs. The wooden hangar for the airship seemed like a fragile structure against the backdrop of the archipelago's majestic and gloomy glaciers. Umberto Nobile personally supervised the unloading of the equipment, trying not to miss a single technical detail. The team worked in unison, imbued with a sense of their own importance and impending historical triumph. Their eyes burned with confidence, fueled by successful past flights and faith in technological progress. They brought with them the best equipment, the most accurate instruments, and provisions calculated down to the gram. The huge cigar-shaped hull of the Airship Italia slowly filled with gas, preparing to take off from the cold ground. It was a time of great illusions when people sincerely believed in their absolute superiority over the elements. Memories of their previous successful expedition with Roald Amundsen gave the Italians extra courage. They wanted to prove to the whole world that they were capable of conquering the northernmost point of the planet on their own. Local hunters and whalers looked at the huge airship with the skepticism of people who knew the true power of the Arctic. But the explorers paid no attention to their gloomy predictions, blinded by the glamour of impending world fame. The preparations required maximum concentration, as even the slightest mistake could be fatal in the extreme north. Mechanics checked the engines day and night, listening to every change in the tone of their hum. Provisions were loaded strictly according to schedule so as not to upset the fragile weight balance of the aircraft. In those days, no one thought about death. The crew's thoughts were occupied only with geographical coordinates and scientific discoveries. The ship continued to move forward, cutting through the cold air and leaving behind the safe archipelago of Spitsbergen. The crew still believed that their machine was strong enough to withstand any vagaries of the local weather. They flew toward their destiny, confident in the victory of human reason over the blind forces of nature. From that moment on, time became their main enemy, relentlessly counting down the hours to disaster. On May 24th, the Airship Italia reached the geographic North Pole, accomplishing its main goal. The people in the gondola hugged and congratulated each other, forgetting for a moment the piercing cold outside. National flags and a heavy oak cross blessed by the Pope were dropped onto the snow-covered ice. It was a moment of supreme triumph for which they had risked their lives and reputations. They looked down through the cabin window, trying to see where the symbols of their faith and statehood had fallen. The ice below remained completely indifferent to these human rituals, continuing its slow, centuries-old movement. For the Arctic, there were no flags, crosses, or nations. Only the laws of physics and temperature ruled here. The celebration was short, as the commander understood the need to return to base immediately before the weather worsened. The airship began a slow turn, heading back to Spitsbergen into the strengthening headwind. The joy of achieving their goal gradually gave way to heavy fatigue and a growing sense of physical discomfort. The engines were running at full power, but the aircraft's speed was rapidly dropping due to powerful gusts of wind. They still hoped to break through this atmospheric front, relying on the power of their engines. The air temperature continued to drop, turning moisture droplets into microscopic ice crystals in midair. It was at that very moment that history began to unfold according to the bleakest scenario. The icy shell on the hull was getting thicker, and the gas's lifting force was rapidly approaching a critical minimum. The engines roared at full throttle, burning precious fuel, but could not overcome the resistance of the hurricane-force winds. They were no longer flying. They were simply struggling not to crash down onto the protruding ice needles. There was no way back, and ahead of them lay only the cold, merciless surface of the frozen sea. On the morning of May 25th, the situation on board went from critical to absolutely catastrophic and uncontrollable. The heavy airship, covered with a thick layer of ice, began to rapidly lose altitude, sinking into a thick, milky fog. The commander gave the order to stop the engines and jettison ballast in order to slow down the deadly fall, but the icy hull was too heavy, and gravity mercilessly pulled them down toward the ocean. The elevators were frozen solid, and the huge machines stopped responding to the desperate movements of the steering mechanisms. The people in the gondola froze, watching the altimeter, whose needle was inexorably creeping toward zero. In that moment, all ranks, statuses, and ambitions disappeared, leaving only a primal fear of imminent death. They looked at each other and saw fear in the eyes of their comrades as they braced for impact. Suddenly, an uneven surface of pack ice covered with sharp ridges emerged from the white fog, rapidly approaching the gondola. Time seemed to slow down, stretching every fraction of a second into an agonizing eternity of waiting for the inevitable hard contact. The first blow struck the stern of the motor gondola, which shattered into pieces, scattering chunks of twisted metal. The deafening roar of breaking duralumin mingled with the involuntary cries of horror and pain from the people inside. The temperature was about 10 degrees below zero, but the squally wind made it feel like -30. Their clothes, damp from the flight through the clouds, began to freeze instantly, turning into a hard, restrictive shell. They had to act immediately to avoid freezing to death in the first hours after their miraculous rescue. Around them stretched a completely empty, endless plain, consisting of frozen salt water and snow. Nowhere was there any sign of land, only moving ice fields stretching to the horizon. They found themselves stranded on the most inhospitable surface on the planet, deprived of communication, warm shelter, and transportation. The trap slammed shut with a dull thud, and the Arctic cold began its slow, methodical assault on their bodies. The realization that some of their comrades had been carried away by the wind forever weighed heavily on the survivors' minds. They scanned the gray sky, hoping to see the silhouette of the airship returning, but the horizon remained hopelessly empty. Everyone understood that those 6 people had no chance of survival without navigation instruments and controls. This loss struck a blow to their collective consciousness, causing them to truly shudder with horror for the first time. It was necessary to take inventory of what had fallen with them from the destroyed gondola onto the ice. People crawled on their knees through the snow, collecting every crumb of provisions, every piece of useful material. They were incredibly lucky. Among the debris, they found a small radio, a sleeping bag, a pistol, and a navigational sextant. These items became their main treasures, whose value at that moment exceeded all the gold in the world. There was catastrophically little food for 9 adult men who found themselves in conditions of extreme calorie consumption. A few cans of pemmican, some chocolate, and biscuits. That was their entire ration for an indefinite period of time. They began to divide the supplies, carefully weighing each piece in their hands, realizing that their lives depended on it. Everyone understood that supplies were not infinite, and that hunger would soon become their constant, merciless companion in this emptiness. Attempts to provide medical assistance to the wounded were limited to applying splints made from pieces of wood and bandages. The icy wind penetrated their clothing, causing uncontrollable shivering, which intensified the pain from their bruises and fractures. The first aid kit contained too few medicines to alleviate their suffering or prevent possible inflammation. The bodies of the survivors began to slowly deteriorate, unable to cope with the constant exposure to extremely low temperatures. The first day was coming to an end, but the sun did not set below the horizon, continuing to shine with a dim, cold light. The polar day deprived them of their usual sense of time, turning their existence into one endless period of wakefulness. They did not know how to survive the coming hours, when the temperature would drop even lower and fatigue would take its toll. This was only the beginning of the real test, for which none of them were physically or mentally prepared. To survive on the ice, they needed shelter that could provide at least some protection from the piercing polar wind. Among the debris, they found a 4-person expedition tent, which became their only home on this ice floe. It took a long time to set up, as their frozen fingers refused to obey them, and the wind constantly tore at the fabric. When it was finally set up, 9 adult men struggled to fit inside this tiny space. At night, which was no different from day due to the polar sun, the temperature dropped to unbearable levels. The ice beneath them drew heat away at an alarming rate, despite all their layers of clothing. People woke up from their own moans and convulsions caused by deep hypothermia of muscle tissue. Sleep did not bring rest. It was only a heavy oblivion, full of nightmares about the falling airship in the cold. Slowly but surely, sanitation problems began to arise. As no one wanted to leave the tent unnecessarily, people had to relieve themselves directly in the cold, which threatened serious frostbite on exposed skin. Hygiene ceased to exist. People quickly grew dirty beards, and their faces were covered with a layer of soot from the stove. They slowly lost their civilized appearance, turning into primitive creatures driven only by the instinct of self-preservation. Every day they went outside to reinforce the ice walls around the tent for extra protection from the wind. This monotonous physical work helped distract them from oppressive thoughts and keep them warm, although it took away their last reserves of strength. They built this fragile bastion, knowing that when the ice compressed strongly, it would crumble like a house of cards. Their shelter was only a temporary reprieve from the sentence that nature had long since passed on these uninvited guests. The red tent became a tiny island of life in an endless, dead ocean, lost far from shipping lanes. It stood out on the ice like a drop of fresh blood, symbolizing their pain, suffering, and unquenchable hope for salvation. Inside, people waged their quiet war against despair, trying to preserve what remained of their human dignity. It was their only home, their fortress, and their potential mass grave in the heart of the Arctic. Days turned into weeks, and the monotony of survival began to destroy the psyche of the inhabitants of the red tent. Hope for a quick rescue melted away, along with the meager rations issued according to the strictest norms. Every gram of food was counted, and the constant feeling of gnawing hunger became the backdrop to their daily existence. They began to economize on words as well as food, sinking into a heavy, oppressive silence. Physical exhaustion manifested itself in everything: weakness in the limbs, dizziness at the slightest sudden movement. People's faces became gaunt, their skin took on an earthy hue, and their eyes sank, burning with an unhealthy, feverish gleam. Frostbite on their fingers and toes became a serious problem, threatening gangrene without proper treatment. The ice spared no one, slowly but surely draining the life energy from every member of this unfortunate group. Waiting for help became torture, as they did not know whether anyone was looking for them or whether they had already been declared dead. The world continued to live its life. Factories were working somewhere, people were drinking coffee in cafes, but for them, time had stopped forever. They felt like ghosts stuck in limbo between the world of the living and the realm of eternal ice. This realization of their own insignificance in the face of the universe broke their will more than any physical suffering. When one of them developed a fever from pneumonia, the others realized that death was near. There were no antibiotics, and the man slowly faded away before his comrades' eyes, coughing up blood onto his dirty sleeping bag. They could do nothing to help him, only give him melted snow to drink and listen to his dying ramblings about the warm Italian sun. The human body is not designed for prolonged existence in conditions of absolute cold and lack of energy. Muscles atrophied, bones ached from the dampness, and the heart struggled to pump thickened blood. The question was no longer whether they would survive, but how many days each of them could endure this torture. With each passing day, hope grew fainter, turning into a ghostly thread over the abyss of inevitability. A small radio station, which miraculously survived the crash, remained their only thin thread connecting them to the mainland. Radio operator Giuseppe Biaggi worked on it for days, trying to assemble an antenna from pieces of wire and metal tubes from the gondola. His frozen, stiff fingers struggled to handle the delicate parts, but he understood that everyone's lives depended on his work. This technical task became his reason for living, pushing hunger and fear into the background. In order for the transmitter to work, it was necessary to turn the handle of a hand generator, which took the last of the exhausted people's physical strength. They took turns at this peculiar dynamo, turning the handle until they lost consciousness from exhaustion. The process was exhausting, but it gave them a false sense that they were actively fighting for their salvation. Radio signals flew through the air, breaking through atmospheric interference, but there was no response for a long time. Then one day, completely unexpectedly, a faint but clear response signal broke through the noise on their frequency. The joy that erupted in the tent was like an explosion. People cried, hugged each other, and shouted, forgetting their ailments. It turned out that their signal had miraculously been picked up by a Soviet radio amateur from a distant Russian village. This coincidence became a turning point in the whole story, proving that their struggle had not been in vain. The transmitter became the heart of the Red Tent, its main treasure and curse, dictating the rhythm of their fading lives. People fell asleep thinking about the morning communication session and woke up in fear that the batteries would finally run out. They were tied to this ice floe by an invisible radio beam that kept them on the brink of madness. It was their only voice in a vast, indifferent desert that made no distinction between heroes and cowards. In moments of greatest despair, even before stable radio communication was established, the group made a difficult and controversial decision. The three strongest men, led by Swedish meteorologist Malmgren, decided to walk across the ice to land. They believed that waiting in the tent meant certain death, and that someone had to try to reach Spitsbergen for help. It was an act of insane courage, dictated by the complete lack of other options for the rescue of the entire team. Preparation for the departure was minimal. They took some of their already meager food supplies, leaving their wounded comrades behind. The farewell was difficult and dry, as everyone understood the slim chances of success of this trek across the ice ridges. The three men disappeared into the white mist, turning into small dark dots that soon vanished from view forever. From that moment on, their fate became a separate, even more terrifying chapter in the history of this Arctic disaster. One day, when his strength finally left him, Malmgren asked the Italians to leave him on the ice and go on. It was classic polar ethics, to sacrifice oneself for the sake of saving others, without burdening them with one's death throes. The arguments were brief, as the healthy men's survival instinct proved stronger than moral qualms and nobility. They left him some snow in a can and left, trying not to look back at the figure freezing against the white background. The remaining two Italians, Zappi and Mariano, continued their endless journey, turning into half-mad ghosts in the ice. Their minds were clouded by exhaustion, and they often lost their way, making meaningless loops across the drifting fields. When hope finally vanished, they simply lay down on the ice, huddled together, waiting for the end of their torment. The white desert watched their agony indifferently, offering neither forgiveness nor a quick, easy release from the pain. They were just tiny grains of sand in this huge ice meat grinder, that was slowly grinding their bones. Nature made no distinction between heroes and cowards. It simply cleansed its territory of weak organisms. The news of the disappearance of the Airship Italia caused an unprecedented resonance around the world, triggering an unprecedented rescue operation. Countries, forgetting their political differences, began to send ships and planes to the harsh Arctic latitudes in search of survivors. Spitsbergen became a bustling base for pilots, sailors, and journalists eager for sensational news. But the Arctic greeted this armada with thick fog, violent storms, and impassable ice fields. Despite past conflicts with Nobile, the famous Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen immediately volunteered to participate in the search. For him, rescuing people trapped in the ice was a matter of honor that transcended any personal grievances or national ambitions. He flew out in a French Latham seaplane to comb the vast waters of the Barents Sea in search of the Red Tent. His experience and intuition gave great hope that the Italians would be found very soon. Food dropped from other planes often crashed into the ice or fell into open water, ending up with fish rather than hungry people. They watched in despair as precious canned food sank into the black water, unable to reach it. Each such loss was like a physical blow, undermining the last remnants of their moral fortitude. They were fed promises on the radio, but their stomachs were twisted with very real, agonizing pangs of hunger. The waiting was more exhausting than the cold, as it forced their brains to constantly balance on the edge between hope and madness. They began to doubt the reality of what was happening, believing that all this rescue was just a cruel game of their sick imagination. No one had prepared them for such a long period of solitude in the company of death, standing at the threshold of their fragile shelter. At that moment, they ceased to be civilized Europeans and turned into hunted animals in a cage. The white desert around them remained as indifferent and silent as it had been on the first day after their shipwreck. The ice continued to drift, melting under the summer sun and covered with a network of treacherous cracks, threatening to destroy the camp. Nature made no concessions to the fact that the whole world was watching them. It lived by its own unchanging, millennia-old rules. Their salvation now depended solely on the brute, penetrating power of heavy ships capable of breaking through this icy shell. While aviation proved powerless against the Arctic fog, the heavy Soviet icebreaker Krasen came into action. This steel giant slowly but surely made its way through the heavy pack ice, crushing the ice ridges with its armored bow. Thick black smoke poured from its funnels, visible for many kilometers, instilling hope in the freezing people. The icebreaker's crew worked tirelessly, knowing that every hour counted and that any delay could cost human lives. First, the lookouts on Krasen's mast spotted two people on the ice. They were the half-dead Zappi and Mariano. They looked terrible, frostbitten, emaciated to the point of being skeletons. They resembled the living dead more than humans. The rescuers pulled them aboard, horrified by the Italians' condition and realizing what hell they had gone through. Malmgren was not with them, and this grim detail left unanswered questions in the history of the expedition forever. Having received the exact coordinates from the rescued, the icebreaker changed course and headed straight for the Red Tent camp. The sound of ice breaking under the ship's bow became the most beautiful symphony in the lives of the camp's inhabitants. They crawled out of the tent, crying and waving their arms at the huge steel machine that was inexorably approaching them. The sailors climbed down onto the ice to help the exhausted people climb the ladder onto the warm ship. The survivors could not walk on their own, their legs unable to support their bodies, weakened by hunger and scurvy during those long weeks. The story of the Red Tent quickly became shrouded in myths and debates about how people should behave in extreme conditions. Debates about the moral choices made by Zappi and Mariano, who left Malmgren behind, continued for decades, provoking polarized opinions. This expedition showed that under the pressure of unbearable circumstances, the thin veneer of civilization quickly wears away. There on the ice, there were no right or wrong, only those who wanted to survive at any cost. The icy expanses, abandoned by humans, once again plunged into their primeval, frightening silence, hiding the traces of tragedy. The abandoned red tent, debris, and rubbish were quickly covered by snow, erasing the memory of human presence. The Arctic reclaimed its domain, as if shaking off the tiny insects that had dared to disturb its centuries-old peace. It did not consider itself the victor or the vanquished. It simply continued to exist in its frozen state. The crew of the Airship Italia paid a huge price for their attempt to conquer the most inaccessible latitudes of the globe. Their story became a cruel lesson for all subsequent generations of explorers, reminding them of the need to respect the elements. The survivors forever retained in their souls the cold of that pack ice that changed their lives beyond recognition. They returned to the warm world of the living, but part of their hearts remained frozen forever in that tiny red tent. Decades later, the story of the Airship Italia became a textbook example of how quickly ambition can be shattered by reality. This disaster demonstrated that no technical achievement can guarantee absolute safety in the face of nature. Man, who considered himself the crown of creation, was helpless in the face of a simple frozen ocean and low temperatures. All the power of human intellect surrendered to the blind, unthinking force of the north wind and pack ice. The memory of those who perished lives on, not in the thickness of the ice, but in archival documents and in the hearts of those who remember their names. They became victims of their time, an era of great ambitions and insufficient technology for safely conquering the North. Their mistake was to underestimate an enemy that forgives neither the slightest mistake nor overconfidence. But their struggle for life deserves respect, for they fought to their last breath, as long as they had the strength. The Arctic did not kill them quickly. It simply gave them the opportunity to slowly realize their powerlessness. Those who remained in the ice forever merged with eternity, becoming part of the very landscape they sought to conquer. And those who survived were forever marked by the icy stamp of this endless, merciless white prison. The story of the Airship Italia is a reminder that the cold knows how to wait, and its patience is boundless.